Good evening, everybody. It's great to see you here tonight at the Leeds International Festival of Ideas 2022. It's my pleasure to welcome you as Chief Executive of Leeds BID and Chair of the festival. The festival is the award-winning Leeds International Festival of Ideas, and we've been running this event since 2017, established as a place marketing project funded by the Business Improvement District, which is a not-for-profit, non-political organisation whose sole objective is the improvement and success of the city of Leeds. And our aim of the festival is a simple one: to put Leeds on the map, to bring the brightest minds to Leeds through a series of compelling talks that we cover such issues as climate activism, food culture, mental health, the metaverse, that one baffled me, and screenwriting. And a festival of new ideas and innovation where we invite world-leading thinkers to Leeds to share new ideas and discuss the world of tomorrow and talk about some of the most challenging issues facing our society today. And this is our last event of this year's festival. And I wanted to take this opportunity to thank the team who've done an absolutely splendid job over the last 12 months planning this event. And they already tell me they're formulating the foundations for LIFI22. So in a couple of weeks' time, you'll get information about that, about what's happening next year. We're delighted that Mary has joined us today. Welcome, Mary, for the last in a powerful series of 11 speaker-led events over the last 4 days, which have seen audiences pass through this building of over 2,500 people. So it's been great, and personally, I'm excited and interested to hear what Mary has to say today, tackling the arts and culture, a price worth paying. I enjoyed you, Mary, on Radio 4 the other day, translating the former Prime Minister's departure speech. It's the first time we've understood anything he's had to say. And Mary, you'll know, is a professor of classics at the University of Cambridge, a fellow of Newnham College. Mary's well known for her media appearances, TVs, books, articles in the national press. So I'm sure you'll join me in welcoming Mary Beard.
Thank you very much, everybody. It is absolutely wonderful to be in Leeds for all kinds of reasons, but I've never been on a stage where I've had such comfy chairs before. So when we get to the Q&A, I'm sitting in one of them. As Andrew said, this is a very wide subject that I'm broaching, so I'm going to miss out lots of important things, but I hope that when we have the Q&A afterwards, if there are things you want to talk about, even if I've not mentioned them, you will bring it up. But I'm going to start a couple of years ago in the real depths of the pandemic, because one of the most striking things then was the way that so many people in arts and culture kept going and invented new ways of engaging with audiences. Now, I'm not, when I say that, forgetting all the people, whether performers or back of house or front of house staff, who actually lost their jobs. But we should remember also that fantastic ingenuity, and I've got just a few examples of ingenuity to show you. The way that museum curators, for example, represented their objects on social media. What you see on the screen here was a runaway hit from the Frick collection in New York, in which every week a curator introduced a painting and a cocktail mix to go with it. Now, I've never quite been certain that that would have been such a runaway hit in the UK, but it certainly was in America. And we should remember, too, the way that we found new ways of making music, enjoying music together online, sharing poetry, and opening up a whole new range of streaming possibilities in theatre and opera, live and otherwise. And I'm sure you know that in those initiatives, Opera North was really one of the stars. Now, I played a very, very tiny role in this myself, because we kept a BBC2 culture programme on air. It was then called Lockdown Culture, for obvious reasons. And this was a programme shot entirely by Zoom and on my own smartphone. And although, apologies to any camera people present, I don't think hardly anybody in the audience noticed that it was shot on a smartphone, actually. But one of the highlights of this, for me, was linking up with Margaret Atwood in Canada by Zoom and having her dramatise Edgar Allan Poe's story of plague and pandemic, The Masque of the Red Death, using, on her kitchen table, homemade puppets and bottles of hand san, right? This was when hand san was something quite new to most of us, so it was quite exotic, event, really. And you can still find this if you search on BBC iPlayer. It's well worth it. So my question, I suppose, now is why were we doing that? And obviously, there were different reasons. But the cultural sector in general tended to get praised for the way they were cheering people up, while scientists and medics and healthcare professionals were working hard on the front line, literally keeping people alive. Practitioners in the arts were helping, as it was said, taking our minds off it, right? Now, I'm not for a minute, and please don't quote me as saying this, I'm not for a minute wanting to undermine the work of scientists and healthcare professionals, and I'm not saying that sometimes a bit of cheering up in the middle of a national crisis isn't quite a good idea. But I do want to say that now, looking back on it, actually, more than at the time, I think that artists, writers, and musicians were also on the front line of our response to plague and pandemic. They weren't just trying to keep our minds off what was going on all around us. They were also trying to help us think harder about the disaster we were in. They were helping us with understanding what plague and pandemic could mean, what their place in the world was, and what their wider effects on us might be. Now, that was certainly the case with Atwood's kitchen table puppet show, making an interesting connection between Poe's very puzzling 19th century fantasy of plague and our day-to-day experience of living it now. But I also found myself at the time often pointing out to people that the problems of how humanity faces plague has been embedded in the cultural tradition of the West from the very, very beginning. First work of Western literature is Homer's Iliad, the story of the war between the Greeks and the Trojans, and it was composed in the 8th century BCE. How does the Iliad begin? Well, it begins with a plague sent by the god Apollo against the Greeks because they dishonoured his priest. Western literature, in other words, starts with a pandemic and has always been committed to help us make sense of that kind of events. Plague really is us, I think. What you've got on the screen here is a nice 17th century Venetian image of the god Apollo coming to shoot with his arrow, i.e. the plague, the Greek soldiers. And there are plenty more examples like this in my neck of the woods. Perhaps the most famous Greek tragedy of all, Oedipus the king, the one in which Oedipus discovers that he's killed his dad and married his mum, and was the inspiration, surprise, surprise, of Sigmund Freud. Well, how does Oedipus the King start? It starts with a plague, of course, because it's always pushing its readers and its audiences to think harder about what plague means and how it impacts on us. So my basic claim here is that arts and culture, whether they're directly about pandemic or not, and I certainly don't want to imply that every work of literature is like the Iliad and starts with a plague, but my basic claim is that arts and culture, they didn't offer us the physical resources, the medical resources, to face our own plague, but they offered us the mental and cognitive resources to do that. They helped us get our heads around it. And in that sense, arts and culture during the pandemic were not an optional extra, they were central in our response. Now, that claim hovers over what I'm going to say this evening on questions of why and how we should support drama, poetry, writing, music, or whatever. To be honest, I'm more interested in the why we should than in the how we should. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on, but we'll have plenty of time in questions to think about the nitty-gritty. But in particular, I want to challenge the dangerous idea that the arts are a kind of cheering up device for the community, that they're an added extra, which are nice to have when there's a bit of spare cash around, but can be dispensed with when there isn't. Now, it doesn't take much to see that that notion that arts are an added extra is the first step in an argument that leads to seeing the arts as a privilege for the privileged. If you're rich enough to enjoy music, dance, drama, fine, you can. If you're not, you can do without, and it doesn't really matter very much. Now, so far I've talked about COVID a few years ago. I've partly done that because there's a little bit of historical distance between us and the pandemic now, a little bit. But I think that those kind of considerations of whether art is to be a privilege of the privileged are going to become particularly acute in the years that come now, when we think about the cost of living crisis, new austerity, and the rest. So I've got a bit of a backward look, but actually underneath it, my mind's wondering about what's going to happen next. Now, I think that those of us that defend the arts, I think that we can be sometimes too timid in our defence. We're too unwilling to get right to the bottom line. And I think we're rather too prepared to come up with arguments that we think governments want to hear, right? And we end up, in doing that, we end up selling ourselves short. Now, I'm as guilty here as anybody else, and I have blagged on about how Shakespeare or Damien Hirst or whoever is really good idea for British soft power, right? And I've spent hours and hours, I confess, in my extremely amateurish way, with a calculator, trying to come up with a rough and ready figure for the net gain to the UK economy from performances of Greek tragedy in the West End, right? How much do visitors spend when they go to the theatre? How many meals out do they buy in the process? How many people do they keep employed? Etc., etc. You put all those down the back of an envelope, put it into a calculator, and you come up with as big a figure as you can possibly imagine. And that's a very common argument that we hear on the radio all the time. The kind of, arts really are a good earner, right? Or that's what we say when we're talking to the Treasury. Now, I'm not for a minute wanting to say that those are entirely unimportant considerations. I mean, if you go back to soft power, I think we might all be a bit worried if we thought that UK culture had an overwhelmingly negative effect on Britain's standing in the world. And there are plenty of other factors too when we defend the arts that we could add in. We could talk about beauty, transcendence, protest, catharsis, identity building, and there's lots more. But I suppose I'm wanting to argue that all those are essentially side benefits. They are benefits, but they're not central. And I think that we need to be a lot bolder in our defence of arts and culture, and to say something more like this. Why do we need arts? Well, we need the arts at the absolute bottom line because they enable us as citizens to face and debate with nuance, sophistication, and empathy the kind of debates that we must face as citizens. The arts allow us a space, and it's a simultaneously safe space and an edgy space, to learn to think and to argue and to see things through different, multiple lenses, to debate with proper complexity about the complex issues that face us, and to go beyond the kind of simplistic outrage that we now associate with social media. In a sense, the arts are something which really do help us work out how we can be a community and disagree with one another. Now, arts and culture, in a way, I would sum it up, I think, as they are the necessities of responsible citizenship, and we cannot do without them. That is a good slogan, but necessities of responsible citizenship, I think it's good. But what the hell does it mean, right? Now, to put some flesh on the bones of that, let me go back again, and I'm not going to take all my examples, I promise you, from the ancient world. I'm going to go back to the ancient world and to Euripides' tragedy, Medea, that was written and first performed in the 5th century BC, and is still frequently staged. The story is a horribly, and I mean horribly, simple one. Medea is a princess and a witch from the shores of the Black Sea who, out of doomed love, helps the Greek hero Jason steal the prize of the golden fleece from her father's land. And you can see her here. Here's the golden fleece that Jason, her paramour, has come to get. And here's Medea kind of giving a magic potion to the nasty serpent who is trying to guard the golden fleece. Jason gets the golden fleece, and Medea runs off with him. They go to the town of Corinth, where they marry and have 2 children together. But while they're living there, Jason decides to dump her for a better prospect. The daughter of the local king. Jason is moving up in the world. In revenge, Medea murders his new wife, as well as her father, the king, and really to get back at Jason, she kills their 2 children as well. At the end of the play, she gets off. She's miraculously rescued, and she's carried off in a divine chariot. That's what you see happening there. That was the kind of the 2-minute version. It's a rather more complicated play than that, but never mind. So what do we get out of that play as a theatrical experience or as a reading experience? Well, of course, lots of things. There's kind of energizing and wonderful, exhilarating poetry for a start. But what that poetry is doing is confronting the audience with the complexity of moral judgment. We watch the play and we feel sympathy for Medea. She's helped her lover and then she's dumped. And we feel disgust at Jason's cruel treatment of her. Only to discover, as the plot unfolds, that we've taken the side of a woman who not only kills her own kids, but also gets away with it. We can't, in other words, I think, watch this play or read it now without reflecting on the nature of crime and the nature of compassion, on what provocation might ever excuse murder, and also on the limits of our own sympathy and the very nature of the judgments we need to make. Now, can a properly functioning society ever do without debates of that sort? Of course, it can't. Could it debate those issues in other ways? Well, yes, it could, and in some ways you might say that those issues are debated in courtrooms across the country every day of the week. But what I would like to claim is that there is no more effective or economical, or in time terms, not money, or inclusively sophisticated way of thinking through those problems than in the under 2 hours that this play takes to perform. It brings us right down to some of the essentials of being a thoughtful, responsible citizen, and it opens up ways in which we learn to be that. Now, as a bit of a parenthesis, I should perhaps remind you that this play, which has been one of the most powerful prompts ever in the history of the West to the discussion of the exploitation of women, this play was written by a man, and it was originally performed entirely by men to an audience composed entirely of men. And I'm throwing out the question now because it is a question that we are currently asking ourselves, whether we think that matters. Can someone write a play about who they are not? Now, that's an issue that is coming up more and more in our discussions. I'd like to see Medea written into the argument a bit more frequently. My main point, though, is that from the ancient world to now, good drama of all sorts, from the popular to the arcane, has been a crucial training ground for, as I put it just now, responsible citizenship, and a prompt to face the most difficult questions that citizens in any shared community must face. Now, one obvious recent example is Alan Bennett's History Boys, a play and later a film set in a grammar school, which pits the old-fashioned teaching style of the main character, the charismatic and subversive teacher, Mr. Hector, against the league table-obsessed headmaster, while in the end, revealing that Mr. Hector was, to put this rather euphemistically, a bit of a fondler of his male pupils. Now, this play has been rather too easily written off, I think, as an exercise in nostalgia, whether nostalgia for old-fashioned teaching, nostalgia for grammar schools, or an attack on target-driven educational policy. In part, it is all those things. But it is also a much more powerful and necessary exploration, not just what we want out of education, but also what we expect of teachers themselves. One big question the play raises is whether Mr. Hector, the sexual predator, was therefore necessarily a bad teacher. And the play allows us to see the complexity in what might look like a very simple, easy-to-answer question. I think a lot of people do come away, and I've sort of witnessed this, with one question in their head. Would we want our children to be taught by Mr. Hector or not? Now, I don't want just to pile up examples here, because I'm sure you can think of many which do similar things, but there are also big and complicated questions in Kwame Kwei-Armah's hugely successful play and TV film, Elmina's Kitchen, set in Hackney's gangland, which helps its audience to see why somebody might actually, understandably and reasonably choose a life of crime over a life of making an honest living. And it asks very powerfully, again, absolutely necessary question of, can you be moral if you live in a world that is not moral? Now, I'm going to, I think, turn these off for a little. Now, one of my big watchwords here, as well as responsible citizenship, is, I suppose, complexity. That what creative writing and drama is doing in each of the cases that I've mentioned, whether they're ancient or modern, and I think you could say, though the argument would probably go slightly differently, I think you could say much the same for music and dance. I think each of those cases is providing a space for us to engage constructively in the complexity of some of the big debates that we face. And it helps us begin to understand, and I think this is absolutely crucial, though it might sound quite simple, it helps us begin to understand what it might be like to think differently from the way we do. It helps us to imagine, I think, on both sides of the stage curtain, what it might be like not to be us. And I think that that ability to think what it might be like to think differently is one of the things on which good and responsible citizenship is founded. Citizenship isn't about being a member of a homogenous interest group. It's learning to live in a community constructively together in which people think differently from each other. And I think if in some ways now I was saying, what is the most important thing that you need to, what's the most important quality you need to have in order to be a most effective member of a political or social community, it is that ability to recognise that not everybody thinks like you. And I think that arts and culture play a real part there. Now, I also realise that this might sound like a typically ivory tower kind of argument that you'd expect from an elderly academic, putting kind of elusive complexity in front of much simpler issues of right and wrong, for example. Now, I think my response to that would be that issues of right and wrong are never simple. And also to say that what contemporary debate often lacks is precisely that injection of complexity and otherness, that good dose of exploring what it would be like not to be us, in order to become fruitful, constructive, and to have some kind of useful endpoint. Now, I don't know what has caused that lack of complexity in contemporary debate, and I don't honestly know if we're now in a worse position than previous generations were. Certainly, I think the view that the crudification of contemporary debate is all a product of social media is itself a very crude argument and needs to be re-looked at. But I do know that the refusal to embrace complexity and to feel that that is something that we need to take on board and welcome almost always lands us in a terrible mess. No interesting problems in this world are simple. Look, for example, at the way we're currently crucifying the BBC, or you might say the BBC is crucifying itself, over the mantra of impartiality. Now, impartiality is easy to sloganise. And there's hardly a person in the world who would say, oh, what's my ambition for the BBC? That it should be more biased. You know, no one's going to say that. That's easy. But it's one thing to sloganise and quite another to agree on what we think counts as impartiality. Now, it seems to me that the whole tradition of creative fiction and performance lets us see that problem. What's an impartial reading of Hamlet, I ask you? You know, we know that doesn't exist. And I think that we have to be very careful, and this is a real problem, not just an ivory tower girl's problem. We have to be very careful that we don't end up killing off our national broadcaster by setting it an apparently simple target that we can all say, yes, absolutely, it's got to be impartial, which is not one that it just can't reach, but one that is in any meaningful sense unreachable. You know, this is a death knell. I think there's something similar in debates about free speech. And I'm going to come back to this at the very end of what I have to say. But often those debates come down to, I want freedom of speech for people like me, right? Quite oblivious, again, to any capacity to imagine what it would be like not to think like me. And there's a tendency for the vocal, and maybe sometimes I'm one of them, to bang on about free speech without bringing into the argument all those swathes of people on the planet who have as much freedom of speech as anyone could hope for, but no one's ever listened to them. And if you want the classical analogy for that, you go to Cassandra, the priestess, in the Trojan royal family in the time of the Trojan War. She's an absolute classic example of that. Cassandra was a priestess, a prophetess, and she always told the truth. She always got it right. But no one ever believed her. Now, we have to think about the Cassandras of this world as much as the people who we believe are being shut up. Everybody, Cassandra talked as much as she liked. She just was never believed. And I think we have to be very careful, again, when thinking about the complexity here and what literature and myth, etc., can direct us to, we have to be sure that we give attention to the privilege of being heard as much as the privilege of speaking. Perhaps one of the places where we can best see how this complexity works, though, is in the so-called culture wars. Now, I think a lot of what are called culture wars is a skirmish which has been fanned by a lot of the media. But nevertheless, we can see here standoffs between different cultural positions that could do with a little bit more thinking through. Now, one example of that, one very good example, and I'm choosing it partly because it brings us to art objects. One good example of that is statue toppling, and here's got the famous scene of Colston ending up in the water. This argument has got blown entirely out of proportion and has gone in many, I think, very unhelpful directions. It seems to me absolutely self-evident that 99.9% of us think that some statues should be removed. Right? We don't want to walk down the high street and see a statue of Jimmy Savile or a statue of Adolf Hitler. You know? And there's almost no contest about that. And it's also absolutely true that statues have always been removed. You know, Romans were always chucking bad emperors in their rivers. The problems we face comes in the grey areas, not the Jimmy Saviles or the Adolf Hitlers. It's in which statues in between beneath them do we think are candidates for removal? And who has the right to decide? Now, I'm afraid that often it seems that we can't ever escape from a very, very simplistic binary divide here. Either pull him down because I don't like him, or leave him up because you're attacking history. And we really ought to allow ourselves to think harder about what these public statues are for as works of art in the public sphere. And I think it's not as simple as honouring those we admire. Let me give you one more example. This guy is not, so far as I know, a candidate for toppling, or at least he's not top of many people's list. It's King Charles I on the edge of Trafalgar Square in London, and he's looking down Whitehall to the banqueting house where he was executed in 1649. What's he doing there? Is he there for us to admire? Of course, he is not there for us to admire, right? Okay, the statue has a complicated history, which we can discuss later. But as a work of art, he seems to me a bit like Medea, that his job now is to make us confront ourselves and our own certainties. Do we think Charles was a good role model and a virtuous person? No, we don't. Most of us are heartily glad that Oliver Cromwell, for all his downsides, defeated Charles in the English Civil War. We don't hanker after the divine right of kings, and even in a couple of weeks, in which the royal family has been centre stage, we still don't hanker after it, and I very much doubt that King Charles III hankers after the divine right of kings. This guy is on the losing side of history. Right? So what's he doing for us? Well, partly he is a symbol of his own defeat, I think, but he's also making us face up to our complicity in his murder. Political progress sometimes depended, I make that past tense, on killing the king. This statue, I don't think, is glorifying Charles I. It's reminding all of us who look at him that our hands aren't clean. Right? Our rights and privileges depend on the fact that we put him, or our predecessors put him, to death. Now, that's a lesson that the classroom alone, I don't think, can teach. I think you need art on the street to rub your noses in it all the time. Now, I expect you see where my logic is heading. If arts and culture underpin effective citizenship, if they provide the tools and the practical training in the complexity of argument and the viewpoints that make us responsible citizens in a complex world, then it's in the interests of the whole community, it's in the interests of the state to pay for them. Now, I'm not here getting into the question of exactly how much or exactly to whom, but I am saying that we will always lose out if we get deflected by the side arguments about culture, about the revenue that the bums on seats in UK theatres bring in, or even about the virtues of self-expression or cultural diversity, important as those things might be. There is no substitute, I think, for the argument that the arts are essential to the functioning of the community and its capacity to think about itself and its discontents. And as such, they should be paid for by the community. Now, at this point, I'm sure some people are thinking, oh, God, that sounds a bit sort of Soviet, give me a time when state-sponsored art has been, produced the kind of creative industries that we really want, Well, I'm going to give you a time when it didn't. You can guess when it is. Go back to the 5th century BC. Who paid for the Oedipus the King and the Medea? Well, a version of Athenian taxation paid for it. And if we were to go to the most read book ever after the Bible. The Bible wins, I think, on this competition, but after the Bible, the most read book ever is Virgil's Aeneid in the West. There hasn't been a day since he finished it in 19 BC when someone hasn't been reading it, the last 2,040 years. How was this book sponsored and paid for? It was a state commission by the Emperor Augustus. Now, I know that people often think, they hear the name Aeneid and they think, oh, that's Rome's national epic, and they do start to think a bit of kind of Soviet-style jingoism. And just occasionally you can extract quotations out of context, which makes that look true. But if the Emperor Augustus thought he was paying for unmitigated praise, he must have been sadly disappointed when he read the Aeneid, for the poem shines a glaring spotlight onto the problems of Roman political ideology, and it exposes the cost of patriotism. Famously, when the so-called hero Aeneas, the founder of the Roman race, abandons his lover Dido in the interests of his national project, but maybe even more so when in the final scenes of the epic, Aeneas, in his rage, gratuitously slaughters an enemy who has surrendered to him. What kind of patriotism, Virgil is asking us to think, is that? And the reason that the Aeneid has been read continually for the last 2,040 years is precisely because it does question the nature of what it is to die for your country or to kill for your country. And as such, it is rubbing Roman noses in the problems that they need to discuss about what it is to be Roman. And it's worked that way for almost everybody ever since. It seems to me that very rarely do classical communities have a practical lesson for us. You know, it's damn stupid if you want a solution to modern problems to go back to the Greeks and Romans, because usually we're much better at it than they were. But in their commitment to paying for art and culture, not for pleasure or enjoyment, self-development or soft power, but as a civic necessity and as an essential part of a citizenly conversation, I think we do have something to learn. That is something I think we shouldn't compromise on. We need the arts in order to be good citizens and to reflect on how to be so. But I want to finish now with just two vignettes. The first is to underline the point that I don't for a minute think that what I've said about the absolute baseline essentialness of arts in a national conversation, if you want to put it like that, I don't think that's a magic wand for solving all the big issues in arts and culture. I think rather, as I say, it's an essential baseline to allow us to think of some of the issues that I've sidestepped, like who gets the funding and who decides and all those tricky points. And if I had another hour or so, or probably two, I would want to chew over some of the issues of class, race, and privilege that are still embedded in this country's cultural choices and priorities. But as we're in the home of Opera North, I thought I would just remind you of a trivial but truly appallingly revealing political spat that took place a few months ago. This is Angela Rayner going to Glyndebourne to see Mozart's Marriage of Figaro. And she was subject from the Tory party to most extraordinary attacks, snide, satirical attacks for this. Now, the idea that in the very House of Commons, a working-class female Labour politician could be ridiculed for going to the opera tells you more than you need to know about one version of arts, privilege, and put down. I was pleased, however, to see that one of Rayna's tweets in reply chimed in rather well what I've been saying about the arts and citizenly conversation. She was replying to Dominic Raab, who is the kind of the leader of this pack of, well, what should we call them? Schoolboys. Pack. Oh, you know, just shut them up, you know. She was replying to then Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab. She said this: "My advice to the Deputy Prime Minister is to cut out the snobbery and brush up on his opera. The Marriage of Figaro is the story of a working-class woman who gets the better of a privileged but dim-witted woman." Villain, sorry. Oh, talking about Freudian slip there. Let me repeat in case anybody heard it first time. Who gets the better of a privileged but dim-witted villain. And, you know, I think that little incident has got such a lot to tell us about the second stage problems that we face, and that we're going to face more when there's less money for most people. The second vignette that I'm finishing with takes us back to issues of free speech that I touched on earlier, and it's the terrible attack on Salman Rushdie in August. Now, there were, in the press and on the radio, some excellently nuanced responses to this, but there were also pieces of terribly crude outrage from different perspectives, largely on social media, from people who clearly didn't know what the Satanic Verses was about, let alone had read it. But there was one thing that, as I listened to all this, that struck me most forcibly. Because it was around the time of the attack on Rushdie that there were several announcements in the UK about the closure in universities of English literature and other humanities departments, not actually ordered by the government as such, but legitimated by views coming from the government that the study of literature and drama and the arts was less valuable than the study of science subjects, STEM subjects, largely because the study of the arts did not lead to such high-paid jobs. We're back into the bums on seats argument. How many, you know, what figure can you put on it? STEM subjects were more valuable because they increased your earning power. Now, I won't go down the route of spending another half hour explaining why I think that judging educational institution or a course by how much the young people, the students, earn at the end of it seems to me so damn stupid. But there was something absolutely to the minute and to the moment here. And in a terrible way, the attack on Rushdie was a bit of a wake-up call. It seems to me that in incidents like that, life-threatening incidents like that now, maybe more than ever or just as much as ever, we need actually to be able to think harder about what literature means, how we read words, how we understand words, what limits we want to put on the right of words to be freely available or not. Right? These are really crucial issues of now, and they're not trivial. So what are we doing? We are closing down university departments that study and teach exactly that. I think, ladies and gentlemen, I rest my case. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary, for that inspirational talk. What we try to do throughout the festival is give lots of time for questions, so people can ask questions with our speakers.
I'm having a glass of wine.
And while Mary has a glass of wine. Now,
I was allowed it when Q&A started.
Now, these lights are really, really bright. So we have a couple of microphones on stands, like boom microphones. The house lights will come up. Thank you very much. So if you do want to ask Mary a question, do raise your hand, and then we'll just wait for the microphone to get to you. And who's going to be brave enough to go through? The lady in the middle there. Yes, the person in the middle, yes. We'll just wait for the microphone. Just they come across there. Excellent. Thank you.
Is that okay?
Perfect.
So a few times you mentioned music, drama, dance, and as a group of visual artists and as someone who runs a visual arts studio, I just wondered if that was a conscious separation of visual arts from the performing arts, or whether that was, I don't know, just your area or whatever.
I was worried that, sorry, this is totally cowardly and feeble of me. I was worried that people would pick me up with endless objections to the fact that, say, the visual arts don't work in the same way. I think you can do pretty much this argument that, I think in some ways Charles I does that, that visual arts show you somebody else's way of seeing the world. And I think that, I might even go to something like cubism or abstraction. And I might say, look, for all the sort of, I'm married to an art historian, so if this sounds too familiar, forgive me. For all the kind of way that art historians talk about that, I think, well, that's fine. But I think what it's showing us is that the world doesn't look to everybody like it looks to us, that there are different ways of representing the world and seeing it. And I might have banged on too much about this idea of needing to be able to see differently or think differently or put yourself in someone's shoes. But you don't have to spend too much time on Twitter to see these echo chambers in which that's one thing that becomes impossible. And no doubt I'm as guilty as, in my own echo chamber, I'm probably just as bad. But from the outside, it is that ability to see how to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And, I don't mean all the time to go back to Greece, and I think that Cubism and abstraction is probably a good example of that. But the Greek theatre, or Athenian theatre, to be strictly correct, is under the patronage of the god Dionysus. And the god Dionysus is also the god of wine, he's the god of theatre, he's the god of, in some ways, letting yourself go, but he's partly the god of being different from how you are, and that's why he's the god of wine. Because wine makes you behave differently from how you are. That's what's good about it. There are many things that are bad about it, but sometimes the idea to see things differently and to behave differently is precisely how we work out differences within a communal structure. So it's no accident that Dionysus is the god of theatre and the god of drinking, because he's making things. He's making you feel different. And I think the capacity of arts and culture, and I would put visual arts into that, to make you see things differently is so fundamental, I think. And it's often, I think, kind of not treated as anything that's very important. I think it's more important than almost anything.
And there is wine available in the bar afterwards. We've got the microphone. Maybe a couple of more hands. There's a few at the back. There's some in the gallery. Just for those with the boom mics, we'll start at the front here, and then we'll work our way back. So.
Thank you very much for your talk. I just thought about this because I think you slightly alluded to it, and it's about the right person having the right role. And I just wondered what you thought about the current sort of Bridgerton debate, kind of black actor play Queen Anne kind of thing.
No, I think I think that I'm very happy with gender-blind casting, race-blind casting, partly because, actually, you can always do it again one day and do it differently. You know, you're not, and I think when those things work, I think they can work in two ways. One, you just don't notice anymore, and that's quite encouraging. Just simply don't notice that it's a man playing this or it's a black actor playing that. But sometimes they make a huge difference in a way that makes you see the play or the film differently. I'm more worried, and I think this is a really tricky one, about saying that only a disabled person can play the part of somebody who uses a wheelchair. Now, I see one very strong reason in favour of that. You know, that is that disabled actors have a rotten time getting parts, and if you get the able-bodied to even taking the part of the disabled, you know, then there's even fewer parts for them to go around. So I think there's a career argument there, but because I've been brought up a classicist, and I think that theatre is about being other and being different, I feel quite anxious about saying that, you know, only a gay man can play a gay man in a play. I mean, I think that the experience of pretending to be something different is actually positive. Though, you know, I do see the career point. You know, when you have, you know, actors who are can't get roles because posh white men get the roles even when they're playing a poor disabled, impoverished disabled characters. You know, that seems, you know, lose-lose for the actor who's disabled, and win-win for the usually posh privileged actor. But it's in that economics and power and opportunity. Otherwise, I think I want people to play everything. And as I say, Medea is a fantastic example of that. You know, there hasn't been a play, really, that hasn't, you know, really crystallised over the last 2,500 years what the predicament of the woman in that way. And it's written by a man, played by a man, two men, right? Right? Go figure.
We had somebody on the stands just on my right there, and then we had somebody in the galleries up the top there. So we'll start on this side.
Good evening, Mary. One of the big ideas in George Orwell's 1984 was the introduction of Newspeak, with the premise that if you denied people the language, they found it difficult to express certain ideas.
Yeah.
I used to be a history teacher and was involved in the curriculum when it was being changed under Michael Gove, when he was Secretary of State for Education. And I found that the debate around the new curriculum seemed to be diverted entirely into content, like how much British Empire do we have in it and so on, and not about the discipline of the subject. And this applies to other art subjects as well, not just history. And also, concomitantly, we were moving in secondary education towards a process by which children were taught the tricks to pass exams, rather than interrogating material with nuances and, as you talked about, with sophistication and complexity. How far do you think this is a problem, given that our governments are moving to the right, certainly over my lifetime, in my opinion, that the control of education is part of this problem?
I think it's a huge problem. And I remember being kind of utterly despairing when Gove's, new curriculum, particularly in what was sponsored by him for the English curriculum, I just thought, okay, I know the Fairy Queen is a really important work of early English literature, but I wonder how many of us have read it. And I wonder, you might say, maybe it's a bad thing that we haven't. But the kind of real nostalgia for different forms of learning, old forms of learning, old forms of curricula, what has Britain done for the world, And, I know David Olusoga talked to you last night, and I think as, we were saying, I think the kind of changes that he and I want to see in the curriculum, it doesn't mean knocking everything out, but it means you've got to look at new things, and you've got to, you sit there, you're my age, Philip Larkin's one of your favourite poets, and you see that he's being knocked off, and you feel a bit sad. But, hang on, you can't have him there forever. And again, it's a bit like Bridgerton and so. These things can change. Syllabuses aren't there for all time. And we somehow are living in a world, and I'd really like to know what you think about this from a point of view of schools, that we talk about it as if the only thing that kids are going to learn is what's on the exam syllabus. And I think that we could not have a school curriculum in which we managed to teach kids all the things that we thought they should know. I mean, it's impossible. So in a way, you have to be able to teach them entry points into those subjects. And, the more you then load the school curriculum, then the more they never are going to do anything which is not on the syllabus. But I really don't see why, actually Philip Larkin is available in books. You don't need to have him on the GCSE syllabus. But it's a caught into a pint pot problem. And then people get very cross. And it's fruitless crossness, actually, because we can't have everything. I don't know what the right answer is, but a big shake-up in some governmental circles might not be a bad idea.
Thank you indeed. We were chatting earlier about things that aren't on in the syllabus, including sign language, which we were talking about. And well done to Joanna today, who's done the signing for us. There was somebody at up the top there. I think there's a few hands at the top.
Hi. I wondered if you thought there were any good examples of what happens to a society if we don't invest in arts and culture.
There's a question.
Can I go back to the ancient world again? It's always so useful, but I'm sorry, it's my job, right? Sparta would be a great... there you have a Greek city-state, which actually, in its earliest phases, from what we can tell from archaeology and a few surviving bits of poetry, was as committed to artistic culture and literature as any Greek city-state was, for reasons that are still, I think, not fully understood. At a certain point around the 6th century BC, they kind of ban all culture, and they start to have a broadly fascist regime in which all the men eat together in shared messes, and there's no home life, and it's an entirely militaristic regime with no arts and culture. They do win militarily for a bit, but within 20 years of beating Athens, actually, in the Peloponnesian War, they had been completely thrashed, not because everybody else was better than them militarily, but somehow they were going down from within. And they turned themselves, and I think perhaps Britain has to watch this, they turned themselves into a curious tourist attraction for visiting Romans. Right. Come and see the Spartans being really weird. So in the end, perhaps they do get back to culture by another route. But
good example. There's another few hands up in the balcony there. I know the microphone's still there. Then we'll come back down here. Not going to leave you out.
Hi, I was just wondering if you have any concern over arts turning into propaganda. For example, if you take Medea, in many ways it was a piece of work that highlighted a woman. But then if you take it from a more Greek perspective, you might see it as almost like Persian hate for her being so barbaric.
Yeah, I do think it's a problem. And I think that I obviously chose my examples with care. And you always have an inbuilt advantage when you're talking about the ancient world, because you can say, look, and it's lasted for 2,500 years, right? So it can't be doing all bad. And I think that there are surprising ways of reading and rereading. And of course, you mentioned Medea. In the modern period, it has been, absolutely central in making a claim for women's rights. It was obviously a very important play in antiquity, but you're right to say we don't know what the Athenian audience thought of that. And I showed the picture of her being taken away at the end in this chariot, because she's going to escape. She's the witch, the princess, and now the child murderer and the murderer of several other people at the same time. And she is whisked out. She's saved. I remember a clever colleague of mine saying some years ago, when we were saying, what do you think, what's going to happen next? What do you think the people in the audience are thinking? And he said, I bet they're thinking, I hope she jolly well doesn't come and land in my town. Thank you very much. And of course, and that these complicated works of literature have very many different responses. And Antigone would be another. The woman who dies because she tries properly to bury her brother. And there's always been debate about whether she was a stubborn ideologue or a pious sister. But in some ways, that's part of the point, because it's in having those discussions that we can learn about how to disagree about things, I think. And to imagine, I think just imagining what the audience thought. I think it's those very simple, basic questions that parachute us into other cognitive, intellectual territories. And that's what seems to me so important. But yes, it's horrible to think how you might have read Medea, probably. Or, look at Cleopatra, or Dido. Was Aeneas abandons Dido? Was that because she was a nasty, grasping queen? Or was it a tragic love story? Most tragic love stories are as ambivalent as that, I think.
There was another hand. Oh, there's one at the front here. I don't know where the microphone is at the moment. He's coming across. Time for a sip of wine, Mary. There you go.
Hello. This feels, I guess, a little bit cheeky in the sense that it's outside of the scope of the main presentation, but something that you touched on towards the end. And it has to do really with class. So the question is, what if the argument isn't necessarily convincing the people who have, the power over how much funding there is, who gets the funding, who gets the opportunities, that art itself is worth investing in, but that people who are perhaps lower down on the scale, so working class people, for example, should have access. I hope that makes sense.
And I think that I was cowardly in not thinking about that, because I think that I do think it's important not to sell the art short, but I also recognise that if you say, look, we can all agree, look, this is at, Leeds International Festival. Of course, we're all going to agree, aren't we, that that there is something, not superficial, but absolutely integral to what a culture and a polity is in arts. It still doesn't solve who decides about how arts and culture is funded and what funding goes where and what kind of gatekeeping there is. I mean, I think the thing about Rub and Angela Rayner was it just opened up that appalling sense of cultural gatekeeping, that actually some bits of culture, never mind who funds it, are not for you. And there's also a kind of I think there's a bit of an emperor's new clothes thing. I think, sorry, I shouldn't talk about this in Opera North, but, and I don't go to the opera very much, but I do sometimes. Could I understand a word of it if there weren't surtitles? I couldn't understand a bloody word. And, there is a sort of sense in which kind of, there's a sort of lot of pretense going on. There's a lot of imposter syndrome and the reverse. And, I mean, the problem with the UK, or let's say England, because perhaps Scotland is different, but, every time you put your finger into the pie, class, and to some extent, along with that race privilege, emerges. There's, whether you're dealing with education, with, arts, with universities, with sport, with the kind of music you like. And to some extent, I'm sort of laid back about that. And like what I was saying in answer to another question, that, in the end, let's think of a gender aspect. I don't mind if girls, by and large, prefer the flute to the bassoon, right? As long as the bassoonists don't get paid more than the flautist, right? As long as the flautist gets as good parts as the bassoonist. As long as any girl who wants to play the bassoon can do, right? And, so as far as I can see it, I think that many opera companies have done really good stuff here in beginning to open this kind of music up in a way that isn't so damn patronising. You ignorant people, would you like to come and explore opera, right? And I just don't know how we, I'm not going to live to see this. I'm not going to live to see working class kids play polo. And Jacob Rees-Mogg going to watch Arsenal? I don't think. I just don't think. No, you turn out now he's actually a #1 fan of Arsenal. But to some extent, I like to say it doesn't matter sometimes as much as we think. We don't want everybody to like the same thing. But when those choices are funded differentially or have prestige, which is entirely a class-based prestige, then I get mad. Right? So, but the whole of the whole of England, I think, is still hasn't got the shackles of class off it. Maybe the arts could help, actually.
Absolutely. And go back to the question from the balcony that said about a place without culture. You said it's core, it's integral. Certainly for Leeds, it's part of our cultural DNA in terms of to have these events and so on. And when I go around the country, visit some of the struggling high streets, where they haven't got an Opera North and they haven't got a national body, they struggle to pull down funding to help their cause. I know you've tried to steer away from some of the funding solution. Do you have any sort of views on that in terms of what the solution would be in terms of that disparity?
Higher taxation. It's a no-brainer, absolute no-brainer.
Okay, we've got the solution. Paul, I know it's Paul. He's been to every event, I think, Paul. I think you get a gold star. Microphone's coming to you.
This might be too big a question, I don't know, but you started off talking about funding for the arts and also talking about the value that we place on the outcomes and the sales of tickets and all of that kind of thing. And as a musician, I've worked in the arts. That's always frustrating because people want to know what you made. But when you go to ask for the funding, people tell you to bog off because actually there isn't enough of it.
Yeah.
Yet, if you're in the sciences and you're into research and development, then that's what everybody wants you to tell everybody that you're doing, and they'll fund it.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a solution in that in terms of balancing there, which could solve some of the other issues that we talk about? And is that solvable? And part two of the question kind of relates to that in terms of the difficult kind of work that people go and see, because people will go and see difficult things because it's challenging and therefore not for them. Do you think that's a vicious circle?
To do the second one first, I think it can be a vicious circle. But I think that the two modern plays that I gave as an example, History Boys and Nelmina's Kitchen, they weren't difficult. I mean, they were difficult without being difficult with a capital D. I mean, they really prompted important questions, but they were very approachable. Reading and seeing and listening to difficult things, I mean, I think there's probably a difference between complexity and difficulty. But I think that really is where education is important. There are some things where as with satanic verses, we need to teach people to read, which is not just kind of bark at words and read the paper, but to think what the process of reading means. And I think it is hard, and you want a mixed economy, which includes the difficult. I think in terms of funding models, I suppose what I would say is that if you treated the arts as essential as science, then there's a chance that different kinds of funding models would follow from that. There is still a kind of ambivalence between arts done by people who have got passion, commitment, etc., so they bloody well do it anyway, however little you pay them, versus, we need to be quite sort of canny with how we spread rather thinly this pot. I think if we could do away with the idea that I play a violin in an orchestra because I'm passionate about it, when it's actually my bloody job and I need to be better, that would be a help. But a few years ago, I shouldn't be saying this really, but I'm going to, I gave a talk at the end of it didn't have digital in it then, it was Department Culture of Media and Sport, it didn't have digital. And I was already beginning to think of these things. And there was a whole day, and I hadn't been able to go to the earlier things, and it was for all the civil servants in DCMS. And I did say something like, if you want to pay for poetry, then you pay for poetry. You don't pay for poetry because you can compute how much Blood Axe Publishers makes out of, if it's a good, you pay for it, right? And I did do a sort of very preliminary version, slightly lightheartedly then, of saying, I just, forget about soft powers. No, you can't justify this by any of those other things. In the end, if Britain wants to make an impact in the world, I'm afraid it can do that more effectively by routes other than music, Music might help, but you're always leaving the arts in a position where they're going to fail the test. There'll be something else that brings more money in or more power. At the end of the day, I was talking to some of the younger people, and eventually, I think we probably were having a glass of wine. They said, do you know, everybody else speaking this day has talked about the economic earning power of the arts or soft power. Absolutely everybody. You're the first person to say it's not about that. And I thought, oh, blimey, you know. That's at DCMS, their away day. That's what these, you know, virtuous, hard-working and underpaid civil servants are getting at their away day. It's all about soft power. You know, putting on Love's Labour's Lost in Rabat, you know. I kid you not.
We've got time for a few more questions. So who's going to get home and think, I should have asked that question, and now they're given the opportunity? We've got some at the top there. Thank you for shouting, because it's bright lights. We can't see you up there.
Hiya. You've got me really thinking about the whole, and this gentleman down here who's a teacher, about how the kids are being trained basically to answer for exams. I am a teacher. I used to be a drama teacher. I teach performing arts generally now. I got out of mainstream teaching for my own sanity. And what I've noticed a lot of, not even just from my own generation, is that we're not being taught critical thinking in schools anymore. And also there is an attitude across the country where people do enjoy art, they do digest art, they do need it, they don't want to pay for it. So there's this mindset where we're not thinking critically about things, but we're also not thinking, we're not placing value in things. And I wonder if there's any way we can get around this, because we've got a couple of generations since I was in school who have missed out on this critical thinking and, looking critically at history, looking at how we do understand the world through different points of view. And then now we're going into another generation of kids who are now being told that it's whimsy, it's just something silly, it's something you can do on the weekend or something. I was actually here on Friday for Aisling B and asked a similar question. And we talked about the creativity needing to continue it when you leave school, even if you've got to do a different job and stuff. But we need to make this sort of mindset in this country that these things are important to our lives. And I just wonder how we can do it.
The prequel to my answer to this, I think I better say this because it partly refers to the other question too. I think that we are in all kinds of ways in a lot of mess with the kind of what we are expecting from schools. My caveat here would be to say, I don't think there is any education system that thinks it's got itself right? If an education system thinks it's doing perfectly, that would be the time to be even more worried about it, right? So I think the fact that we argue and debate shows an investment, actually, in the school curriculum. But the trouble is, it seems to me, and I'm saying this, my mum was a teacher, but I'm a bit of an outsider when it comes to school education. But looking from the outside, you want to carve out some more time. And if someone could explain to me what the point of GCSEs was, another time they take, I'd be really interested to know. They start out, they're the descendants of school certificate when people could leave education at 15 or 16. They don't have any function now. And the amount of I'm not talking just about effort, but what you say suggests that the need is to free up, part of the school day for doing things that aren't that. And I said before, look, we can't fit into the school curriculum everything we need to teach. I think there's also a bit of we're teaching kids probably things that aren't necessary. And as I'd love to know from teachers, what time does things like SATs take? What time does GCSEs take? What time do the league tables take? So I think there are ways that we might say, oh, look, let's loosen up a bit. And, I think, this is partly because my mum was a teacher. I kind of think that, maybe we can trust teachers just a bit more to do what is right for their kids. Now, I know exactly what the answer of Gove would be to that. But some of them were failing that, unless you bring up standards and have league tables and standardised assessment, etc., some will get left behind. I'd like to see more evidence for that, honestly. And I think that, increasing the prestige and power of people who are actually doing the teaching would be one start, wouldn't it, to this? It is like old Hector. I think the History Boys is quite a good example, because, I've always thought it was very funny that a lot of very middle-class kind of mums and dads came away from the History Boys. You could see them walking out the theatre, think, oh, great, that's what we want. And then, you wanted to say, so you want your son to go to a school where Mr. Hector is putting his hand on your son's knee? No, you don't. Or yes, you do. And we do need a kind of a conversation about what we think teaching is, really, as well as what we think education is. And a bit more money wouldn't come amiss. I always find it very, very odd that in the discussions about the difference between maintained schools and independent schools, you hear it a bit, but very rarely do you hear it said, actually, they've got 3 times per capita their cash in the independent schools. And you can't do much on the shoestring. Again, it's kind of, we have this kind of notion, like I was saying about music, this kind of, you'll do it for anything, because you're passionate. My fundraising team in Cambridge is always saying, show your passion. And I think, I don't care about my bloody passion. I need some money, right? You don't sell, you don't sell heart transplants by passion. So why does a classicist have to be passionate, right? It's those kind of, utterly unthought out assumptions that how you break them down, God only knows.
I like that. The freedom in the school timetable, I like that. Somebody else had their hand up.
This must be the last one.
Do you want to wait for the mic? He's going to come. Look at that. He's like a gazelle. He's there. He's there.
Hi, Mary. You may have been asked this over the intervening years quite a few times, but in terms of culture and the place in it of your debate with Boris Johnson about Greeks and Romans, it seems to me that rather than the question at hand, the audience, myself included, were more interested in you being Dirty Harry to his punk, rather than whether the Greeks were better than the Romans or vice versa.
It was let's say, like most of these sort of stage debates, it's a damn stupid question, but sometimes damn stupid questions are quite revealing. I don't know how the audience took it. I can only tell you how I approached it. And I don't think I come well out of this. I was bloody determined to beat him. So I over prepared. And, to be fair to him, that he was doing this, it was a charity gig, and he's not unpleasant. in those kind of scenarios. It wasn't unpleasant. And I'm a professional classicist, and he did it as an undergraduate, and, fair dinkum, he was fair game. What I thought was interesting, if you look at the debate, and it's still available on YouTube, you see in microcosm his argumentative failings that you see in politics, that he just told porkies, basically. Or rather, it isn't that he sets out to tell, or it wasn't on this occasion. It's just that when confronted with an objection, he will say anything to get himself out. And so I thought it was enormously revealing of his argumentative strategy, in which facts did not play a large part. But happily, I won, But I wouldn't be talking about it if I'd lost.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions before we go to the God of Drink.
Yes, I'm going to need
I'm going to go
drink.
for this side because I've neglected the people in the upstairs. You can't get over there, so you're going to have to shout. Go for it. Oh, there's the mic. Look at him. He's brilliant. Well done. Very versatile.
Would you say the problem with funding is actually just an issue? Yeah, like an issue of scale now that everyone lives in smaller communities?
Funding an issue of scale.
Much smaller now that everyone is more connected with effectively like Tower of Babel background into everyone splitting off into smaller groups where they can't communicate. So everyone has their own ideas and their own arts.
I think there is a kind of... It's much easier to live in an echo chamber now than it was. But I don't... Any funding scheme, I'm afraid, ought to be able to manage this.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not in any big arts funding body trying to share out limited resources. And, actually, I'm a bit, I should be a bit more humble about this because, if you're trying to share out limited resources, I don't know how you do it. And I think, but there's just a bit, I think there's too much deference in this. And I do think the Rushdie example, I think we just ought to say, what are we going to say at the next election? Do we want arts to appear anywhere in a manifesto? Because it occasionally has a bottom line, but not much. And we've got to be a bit noisier, I think. And we've got to be a bit less obedient and a bit less grateful. We shouldn't be grateful for funding that you can't do the job on. Part of the reason I don't go into the micro is I don't know how to do it. I just don't know. You go back, how old's the Arts Council? 50 years or so? Mm-hmm. It was a bright new idea. It was the idea of actually ploughing public money into arts as essentials. That's what the Arts Council was. But now it hasn't got money for a cup of tea, really, I don't think. So, and it's not going to, realistically, I don't see the economic strategy of the present government leading to a bonanza for theatre, right? Frankly, or you name your arts, And I think, I think we're in a hole, really, But I'm not going to stop saying, this is this is not paying for it. This is essential funding, and we shouldn't be quite so. We shouldn't have the begging bowl quite as open as much, and we shouldn't be quite so grateful.
No. See, investment in tomorrow. Last question. Hold on. We're just going to get... Here he comes again. So just so everyone can hear at the back. Looks like my window cleaner, actually. He's got a long... There we go.
Do it there.
He's there. Go on, there you go.
No, I was just going to say that anyone who's been at any point in the public sector, filling in even the smallest, or receiving even the smallest sum for an application for funding for anything, will know exactly how you measure it, and it's by outputs.
Yes.
And you know, with all due respect to Andrew and the Leeds bid, even this event is measured, I suspect, by the output, which will be the benefit to the economy of Leeds in being seen as, I'm not saying this is a bad thing at all, in being seen as a city which can stage this kind of culture. And so it's always, even if it's £12,000, what's the output?
That's right. And it's the same...
output, I think, is the
that's right. It's the same in universities. You know, it's right through the public or quasi-public sector, and I don't know what you do about it. You know, changing people's minds. You know, it's God only knows. God only knows. But I don't think it's, you know, realistically, I'm not foreseeing a bonanza from any party.
No. And I think that's why business improvement districts, which are not I'm going to come in here on this. We're not for profit. We're non-political, and we advocate. We advocate for the place. So the measurable outputs is the business community is saying, let's invest in culture, let's invest in the arts, let's have the tallest mural in the United Kingdom on the side of our train station. Let's invest in arts and culture, because it is important that we don't always have to have that measurable return, because we know it works.
97% of the attenders had said they were significantly impacted by the experience that they had at the Leeds International Festival.
Absolutely. Tweet that later. And particularly for our last speaker. And I think it's been a joy to have you. It's been inspirational. I wish you were my history teacher at school. I would have probably learned a lot more. All it falls upon me to say, this clock is telling me we're over. But we've thoroughly enjoyed you being here tonight. It's been great. Let's give it up for Mary Bird.
It was great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.